Rich, man, it's the last Becoming a Best Ball Bro episode. How you feeling?
You know, I can't believe we made it. I both think it's been a very long summer, but you blink and it's all over. The last drafts are popping off, and then just before you know it, the ball will be in the air and the NFL will be underway.
Yeah, look, I gotta say, it's been a pleasure doing the show with you. Chopping it up every week. One of the highlights of my week each week. With that being said, the end of Becoming a Best Ball Bro means that it's the end, or, we're starting to see the end of best ball season and drafting season. And one thing I won't miss, Rich, is drafting Drake London and Kyle Pitts and having some moron draft Kirk Cousins in the 8th round for absolutely no freaking reason. I'm JJ, and I've been playing in best ball leagues for years, but there are people out there who play a lot more than I do, and there are people out there who have won a lot more than I have, and I want to learn from them. This season, I'll be documenting my journey of max entering Underdog's Best Ball Mania contest, and I'll be doing so with guidance from some of the most successful best ball players on the planet. This is the year where things start to change. This is the year where I officially become a best ball bro. Welcome into another episode of Becoming a Best Ball Bro. I'm JJ Zacharyson, joined as always for one final time, hopefully just this summer. Maybe we'll run it back next year, but one final time, Rich Ryan. Rich, what's going on, brother?
If I'm so lucky. It's been a blast potting with you. I'm going to savor the next 40 minutes or an hour. Had a great draft weekend back east, back west to finish up these drafts, get the season ready, and I can't wait.
That's right. You had your draft. I had my home league draft as well over the weekend. Did everything go well for you?
Yeah. Night one, everyone went a little too hard. We forgot that we're all in our mid to late 30s and we're all dads now. I think combined, we all have 16 kids now. I mean, it's a 14-team league, wow. But just kids everywhere. And yeah, everyone thought they were a little younger than they were on night one.
Oh yeah, that's all. It's always how it goes. Always how it goes. I had my home league draft too. Walked away. I had nice cheap keepers in Tank Dell and Devon Achane, two guys that I was pretty into last year. And so, it was nice starting the draft with, above average keepers. It was a nice little auction draft. And it was just, we're all over the country, like I said. So we were all, on like a video call, just talking, what to each other throughout the entire draft as it goes. I
was sweating the draft order randomization for us because I kept Breece in the first round. So obviously I want as late a pick as possible. So I actually ended up getting pick 12 and on the return I got Drake London, which like 20 players were kept. And for me to get London at 16 was pretty an amazing start. Better than I could have asked for. Yeah,
you should feel good about that for sure. So look, Becoming a Best Ball Bro. This is, I think, episode 15 that we've done this summer. Started in May, ending here at the end of August. We've had amazing guests throughout the summer. We've had former BBM winners. We've had complete nerds and stat nerds that dig into this stuff. Shout out Mike Leone. We've had folks who have more of a vibes based approach. We just had really, really smart people on this show. I feel very lucky that I've been able to talk to them and we've been able to dissect some of that stuff. But I think the thing that we need to do is just talk about some of the stuff that we've learned throughout this journey. Because, I know that this journey is a JJ Zacharyson branded journey, but it's a journey for you too. And a journey for everyone who's been listening to this show, over the last few months. When I was at the Fantasy Football Expo, so many people were coming up to me talking about how much they appreciated this show and how much they were learning from it. And it was awesome. It was one of the highlights of my weekend, just hearing those stories and hearing how other people are indeed going on this journey as well. And so Rich and I have come prepared with a few things that we just want to talk about at a high level of the stuff that we did learn and take away from chatting with these incredibly smart guests. So Rich, I'll start off and kick it off to you and say, what's one of the key things that you learned throughout doing this series?
Yeah, I would say one of the top things is when to diverge from ADP on the platform, and mainly the difference between a time-boxed competition where drafts are going to be over in a couple weeks, and BBM where the drafts are open for months. And I believe it was Leone who was the first person to touch upon this. And there are just spots in BBM where you feel like getting cute, but we know, and we've seen it over the summer, how much ADP naturally shifts, whether it be an understanding of volume or somebody looks great in camp, where there are going to be combinations that you naturally get in May or June that you're not going to get later on. So you don't have to force it in some spots because ADP is going to shift for you. Whereas in a time-boxed competition, there are spots where you can get cute because you're trying to create combinations that your opponents might not have. So diverging from ADP is a little more relevant. And then in the final rounds, John Warner talked about keep on scrolling. Round 17 and 18, don't just look at ADP, who's being drafted there. Like, it's okay to click some darts that may not be going, that the platform is telling you should draft in the 200s here because you want to have a shot. You want to have a Will Shipley. You want to have somebody that's going to be lower exposed that might have some upside. So that was definitely one of the first things I took away from all this.
Yeah, I'm going to piggyback off of that as one of my items that I want to bring up. And again, this is definitely just along the lines of what you just said. But, especially everyone that came on basically agreed that round 2 was really flat this year. And I still think to this day, round 2 is really flat. It honestly starts around that 111 into 112 area, right? And so if we naturally know that, then why are we going with the same players in the same kind of turn, 1-2 turn, as what everyone else is doing? Now, to be fair, I fell into that trap plenty through the first few months, couple months, maybe a month and a half, 2 months, maybe even into July of doing that, right? Where I was just getting like Marvin Harrison, Drake London over and over and over again, or I was getting Puka Nacua. And, at that time you could get Puka Nacua and Marvin Harrison, which was a nice little week 17 game stack. But what I realized as, I was moving forward with this is if we all recognize that it's flat in the second round, and if you do have one of those back end round 1 picks where it's just death, it sucks. The 112 is horrible because there's teardrops seemingly everywhere throughout the early parts of your draft. But if you know that that's coming and that's happening, why not just differentiate more with your first and second round pick and take 2 second round guys instead of getting a standard 1-2 turn player of Drake London, Marvin Harrison, or Jahmyr Gibbs, go after a Jonathan Taylor and Jalen Waddle start or something like that. Now, to be fair, I didn't do that frequently enough. I wish I would have done it more, especially in hindsight. Part of my logic was like, maybe things are really going to emerge and change and we're going to have a clearer picture. Nope. Literally the opposite happened, right? Like literally we just saw fewer and fewer players really start to get there. I mean, at one point it was like, oh, we finally got one in Debo because of all the Ayuk stuff. And then that it still hasn't really come to a conclusion yet. And so I think that's a good learning though, is like, to piggyback specifically in that second round, if you are at a turn, to just reach just a little bit, because oftentimes that small reach can really differentiate your lineup. And, sometimes too, like I remember I was drafting Devontae Smith a lot in the late third, but then even earlier on, before Smith's ADP rose, I was okay with getting him, with CeeDee Lamb in the third round. And now that's just where he goes. So you might even see it as a bad call at the time, but it's actually not a bad call. And again, do that in the non-BBM environments more frequently, like you said, because in those environments, that there's sort of this like truncated time frame as to when we're actually able to draft and able to take advantage of that. So yeah, I think that's a really good place to start here. All right.
Yeah, we were begging just on the Debo note. We were just begging all summer for some receiver to please separate themselves to the top of the second round.
Yeah,
we
never
got it.
Debo went 110 a lot, or 111 like a lot, like during that period where it was like definite that Ayuk was going to Pittsburgh. But I do think though that that's a big learning, is that when you have those time box contests where it's only going to be a week or two long until that thing is filled and done, those are the contests where you can really differentiate more. BBM's just a little bit different. All right, let's go to your next item.
Yeah, so this one is descriptive information versus predictive information. I stole that line from Liam Murphy. And the first thing I want to do is just like he and you said on that show, we don't want to besmirch any of the work that someone like Hayden Winks has done looking at past contests and what worked and what the people that reached the final did to create their roster, because that is valuable information. But we just don't know how translatable it's going to be moving into the future. Looking just at last year with late tight end, I don't know how that's going to help us this year when we don't have that crop of young, athletic rookie tight ends. So we want to use that information the best that we can to try and draft. But as Mark Garcia brought up, we don't know what's optimal yet. Yeah. It could be three running back builds. It could be something funky that people just haven't had the courage to try to roll out yet. So I think my main takeaway from this is don't be married to one strategy just because it's worked. This is kind of like when you're in the draft, let the draft fall to you, and there just might be natural pockets where if you somehow go running back early, that's going to be the dictator where, okay, maybe this is a 4 running back build. Yeah. Or if you wait on running back, that's when you're going to go with 5 running backs. So don't be married to a specific number in each position. Just kind of let the draft come to you and don't let past results always drive how you're drafting.
Yeah, I think that plays into like what Hayden Winks talked about too when he was on, talking about like the he digs through history of BBM better than anyone, or just as good as anyone in the space. Leone does that a lot too, just as well as anyone. And one of the things that Winks brought up that I think a lot of people generally follow is the idea of getting 4 wide receivers through the first 7 rounds, because historically over multiple years, the teams who didn't do that were so dead. We're just, the hit rates were so bad. And so what he's doing is saying, these are the kinds of learnings. We don't have to go so extreme and say you got to get 6 wide receivers through 7 rounds. It's more so the idea of here's the baseline of what you should really think about through those 7 rounds to ensure that, you're not doing anything wildly stupid while you're drafting. And that's been something, while I'm drafting, I'm always thinking about that. Like when I accidentally only get 3 through 7, I'm like, all right, well, I probably need a 9 or 10 wide receiver build right now. Like that's the general gist of it. So I think those like super high level zoomed out approaches and looks to best ball can be really, really helpful. Another thing, this is a pretty basic one, but I do think that the stressor of the importance of game stacks has just been really important on here based on the data that's been shared. And, Leone talked about too, about not ignoring week 15 and 16 as well. And, I think what I've learned through doing the drafts is if you can lean into week 17 and lean into that correlation, you can sometimes just naturally come up with week 15 and week 16 game stacks without even realizing it. But it's the idea of really understanding why we're doing what we're doing with those week 17 game stacks, where you need that variance. You're going to be playing the biggest pod that you'll be hypothetically facing throughout, the whole BBM tournament. And so obviously in those scenarios, you want the high upside, you want the high variance, and you want those game stacks. No different than what we do in DFS. I shouldn't say we anymore because I barely play DFS these days, but what folks do in DFS in team stacking and game stacking is if that game goes off, that you're in a really, really good spot. So this year, last year I was obviously in the more limited action I was getting. I was obviously still looking at week 17 and trying to do that. Now this year, we had the clip of me, talking about memorizing the week 17 matchups pretty early on, which still is unfortunately in my noggin and will probably be up there for the entirety of the season and will probably then screw me up next year while I'm drafting these teams. But I have leaned in, like every BBM draft that I do, which I do now live. I haven't done a slow BBM since early June, but of the BBM drafts that I do, I always have that playoff sheet in front of me because I am interested in what's going on in week 15 and 16 as well, because you do have to get through those rounds, even if the pods are a little bit smaller.
Yeah, and then right off that, talking about game stacking and what fits your roster is my last point. It was all the way back, first guest, Pat Carrain. Just because there's a falling value doesn't mean it's going to be a fit on your team. Yep. It's going to be nice to get someone like, let's say, CJ Stroud, many picks after ADP, but when you go to that gunfight in week 17 and you need all the ammo you've got, can you really survive with a naked CJ Stroud, a naked pocket passer? You probably can't. So sometimes there's just going to be guys staring in your face, past value, but if he's not a fit on your team, you just have to click on somebody else, as painful as that is.
Yeah, his example I remember, and it stuck with me, was that Joe Burrow one, because Burrow would fall, and he still does at times in drafts, where not as much because people are drafting quarterbacks earlier, but he'll fall at times in drafts, and you're like, oh my God, I'm going to get a 20 pick discount on Joe Burrow. But if you don't have Jamar Chase and T. Higgins and you already drafted a quarterback early, you might not want to go that direction because that doesn't fit your individual team. That was one that really, really stuck with me from Crane. So I'm glad that you brought that up. The last one that I want to talk about is, again, this is sort of like a DFS thing where we always look at, percent rostered on DFS to see, if a guy is rostered on 80% of lineups, 70% of lineups, because obviously that's how you get your edge. Is if you have a low rostered player who then goes off, that's how you do well in daily fantasy. It's no different in best ball, specifically best ball mania. I found this to be interesting because I don't think my brain necessarily went this direction immediately. I'm always thinking about my own team, my own exposure, and whether I'm over or underexposed to a certain player or heavy or light on a player. Whereas I do think that it's important, and this is what a lot of folks have, and John was one who definitely brought this up a lot, where you have to pay attention and think about, was this player, this is for BBM specific, where you're drafting in May through August, was this player rostered a lot and drafted a lot in May and June and early July versus right now? A good example of that is Sam Darnold. Like, I have almost given Sam Darnold an extra bump in value because there were a lot of drafts that happened earlier this offseason where Darnold didn't get drafted at all. And so if I have Darnold on my team and he does well during the playoffs or just, throughout the entire season, then my team's getting an edge. It's why, when you get an emergence like a Jordan Whittington, let's say, and look, Whittington might not do anything this year. Like, he might not be relevant whatsoever. But when you get an emergence where he wasn't being drafted at all in June and in May and all that, but he emerges, and now it's like, okay, sure, he's going to be their wide receiver 4 at best, probably to start the year, but maybe an injury happens and things can go a certain way, and we already saw that he looked pretty good. If you're rostering him, then that's an edge because the earlier rosters did not draft him. And so it is important to look at this, the overall exposure of the tournament and thinking about players who might be, and this is actually another conversation I had at the Fantasy Football Expo. I was talking to Scott Connor about this, who was on Late Round Perspectives earlier this offseason. He's more of a, we've talked a lot of dynasty and such together over the last couple of years. But one of the things that he brought up was with Clyde Edwards-Helaire, where there are now drafts, and maybe that's going to change now because Deneric Prince officially,
R.I.P. the Prince.
got released. But it was interesting. It was an interesting perspective. It made me feel a little bit better because I was drafting not a ton of CEH, but a decent amount of CEH early on because he felt like one of the safer handcuffs. But then he made the point that, okay, now you're seeing this emergence of Prince and Carson Steele, and all of a sudden, Clyde Edwards-Helaire isn't being drafted in as many BBMs. And so your earlier BBMs with CEH, it's actually not a bad thing because now these newer teams will not be exposed. And what if CEH really is the number one handcuff in the top? And, Isaiah Pacheco, knock on wood, goes down at the wrong time for Pacheco managers. And then CEH is the guy you need, so it's having that holistic mindset that I've admittedly not been as good at from a game theory perspective because I've been so focused on being an analyst in season long, which is a 12 to 16 team kind of endeavor, 10 to 16 team endeavor. And it's just different, right? Because you don't have to worry about that kind of thing. It's just not this big tournament where you're worried about duplicate players. It's one player pool, right? And it's a really interesting dynamic to layer on top and to think about because it's really, really important.
Well, and the crazy thing about that is that we can never control the when those things happen.
Yeah.
We can't control Deneric Prince getting all this camp buzz and getting preseason carries to then devalue CEH's value. Mm-hmm. Same thing with a Burton versus Yoshivas, right?
Right.
We can't control when camp narrative, the drumbeat just gets so loud that you can't ignore it.
Right.
That Yoshivas is all of a sudden getting drafted. So we have to just be so reactionary to understand when to pounce and not ignore it. And these windows can be really short too.
Yeah.
Where this information all of a sudden heats up, this person becomes draftable, and then you go from there.
This episode is sponsored by Underdog Fantasy. There's no better place to play best ball than at Underdog. There are leagues starting all the time, and you can choose whether you want to do a slow draft or a fast one when entering one of those leagues. And you don't just have to play Best Ball Mania to play best ball at Underdog. There's a wide variety of contests to choose from. You can even check out Underdog's other games as well, like Pick'em. Right now, you can get in on the action with a deposit offer and free copy of the late round draft guide just by signing up and depositing. Just head to UnderdogFantasy.com or download the Underdog app. When you sign up, use promo code LATEROUND and make a deposit for a deposit offer and a free copy of the late round draft guide. Again, that's promo code LATEROUND. Now back to the show. Now we're going to get into something that folks have asked me about for the last 3 months, seemingly. And look, I've talked about this a little bit, throughout the show and when bringing up guys that I've been drafting and all of that. But at this moment, Rich, I am 144 Best Ball Manias deep. I am hoping to do the last BBM live stream of the season on Thursday. Like I want people to be there with me. It's sort of like the ending of me actually becoming a best ball bro is how I see it, right? And so I want to get the final 6 done, over the next 48 hours, basically. So by the time you guys are listening to this, hopefully I'm a couple more deep than where I'm at right now. But I do have my exposures. I do have my numbers to share. Now, I do not have very high exposure numbers. I don't know if it's because of my mindset, the way I drafted. I don't know why these numbers are what they are, because I see some people in the 30s with some of the 30% exposure with some of these guys. My highest exposed player, I think some people are probably shouting Zach Charbonnet right now after, the first half of the summer, is Jaleel McLaughlin, Rich. I ended up with 22% of my BBM rosters having Jaleel McLaughlin. He's my only player over 20% though. Do you think that's a mistake at the end of the day? Like genuinely, do you think that this is a bad thing from a game theory perspective to only have the one dude above 20%?
I don't know. So this is the area of the draft where I definitely think naturally you should have your player takes, right? Because we know that early on in the draft, we naturally have to have flatter exposures because the cost of those picks is so dramatically high that if you are to brick or if the guy shreds his knee, then you're just completely screwed. So this is definitely the area of the draft where you should be having higher player takes. And I don't know. It depends to me if there are certain game stacks perhaps that... Yeah. So we've talked about it all summer, the Jacksonville and Tennessee stack.
Yeah.
So I feel like it would be appropriate if all of those players clustered, you had high exposure on, because it was a very easy game to stack, and it's later in the draft where you're getting all these values that you can then attach to higher value players that you're taking in the first couple of rounds. So I think that would be more defensible, but I don't know. I don't think there's a problem with having flatter exposure. Again, this goes back to we don't know what optimal is just yet. But I were to say, if there are players that people own in the 30s, even the 40s, for goodness sake, they should be coming later in the draft because you're not putting yourself as much at risk.
Yeah, the other thing too is when we talk exposure and we say it's flat, yes, it's flat because I only have one guy over 20%, right? Actually, only one guy over 18%. And it's Jaleel McLaughlin at 22%. I have a lot of players though, over 14 and 15%, so that's still basically doubling up, the market, in terms of exposure, sometimes even more, just because some of these guys might not even have been drafted, in every single draft. I don't really remember what was going on with a Tyrone Tracy early on and stuff, but regardless, a lot of I have plenty of players that I clearly took a stand on. It's just that
I will say, just looking at this, there's one player that clearly stands out to me.
I want to hear it. Let's hear it. Let's hear it.
You discussed him briefly on your stream today. It's Antonio Gibson.
I know. Can you believe this?
We've been on the negative Ramondre train, but I didn't know you went full leverage on Antonio Gibson.
I didn't either until all of a sudden I'm looking at my exposure. I'm like, I think this was like 2 weeks ago. And I'm like, man, I got a lot of Antonio Gibson right now. I really do. So I'll read this list so that people are on the same page, and we can dig into Gibson a little bit more. But McLaughlin at 22%, and then at 18%, I'm mixing in running back and wide receiver here, but it's mostly running back. I have Chase Brown. That shouldn't be a surprise. Antonio Gibson, that's a surprise. We can talk about that in a second. Blake Corum, I think, is kind of a surprise too, because it's not like I've gone out and said draft Blake Corum in your season-long leagues. The Blake Corum stuff for me has been game stack related, right? Because I really like Arizona. And so he's a very easy, like, bring back in that kind of environment. But then also, I think that there's going to be some standalone value with him that might be unpredictable, and you don't have to worry about that in best ball. And then he has the contingent upside. If Kyron Williams goes down, Blake Corum is low-end RB1, high-end RB2 in fantasy. So I like that contingent upside. Zach Charbonnet, I've cooled off a lot on based on coach speak stuff, what we've heard about Kenneth Walker, and I've gotten Walker up to market value, thank goodness. Like I was able to get that up to the 8% that I wanted to get it up to. But Charbonnet, I'm at 18%, which again, I don't think that pick, even in hindsight, like knowing what we know now and being more bullish on Walker than I was a month and a half ago, I'm not that upset because obviously the upside is still there with Zach Charbonnet. Like he's still a top 3 handcuff in fantasy football. So I'm not that upset about having as much Charbonnet as I did. Najee Harris, I think, is somewhat of a surprise for people. He's also at 18%. I think my Jaylen Warren exposure is at like 11 or 12. I don't really know exactly why this happened. I think it's more so I had Najee straight up over Jaylen Warren, and where they go in the draft, you know, in that like early 8th round range, where they get drafted is where Ramondre, Zamir White, you know, I started cooling off on Jonathan Brooks the last like month or so, month and a half, like where those guys generally get drafted, and I'm not getting them, and I'm instead opting for a Steelers running back. And that Steelers running back, I just liked Harris a little bit more because I think he's one of those players that coaches like more than fantasy analysts might like, right? And then there's obvious contingent upside as well. So Harris, I'm at 18%. My number 1 wide receiver, which is probably one of my best just general bets based on what's gone on in the preseason and where, you know, his ADP kind of dipped a little bit at one point, but then got back up and maybe rose a little bit higher than where I was drafting him. Brian Thomas, he's at 18% as well. I think he's a smash pick in season long too. This goes back to the Tennessee Jacksonville stuff that we were talking about. Like we're really into that week 17 game. Tajay Spears, 16%. No one should be shocked about that. DeAndre Hopkins, 16%. No one should be shocked about that. Unfortunately, you know, this was pre-Hopkins injury, but I have been drafting him still a little bit after injury too, because he should be back in week 1 and you're getting a discount with him. And then I have a bunch of dudes at 15%. I have Ray Davis, Tyrone Tracy, Chris Olave might be a little surprising for people to hear, Deontay Johnson, Jalen Waddle, and Tony Pollard. So I'm very invested in Tennessee overall. And I'm invested in a lot of those, like, you know, like post dead zone type, you know, early double-digit round running backs.
So I want to circle back to what you asked me about having higher exposure. And the more I think about this Antonio Gibson, I think this is actually the spot where if you believe in a player or you believe that people are too strong on the other side, I think this is the spot to have leverage and be over leveraged and gamble. It might even be spots where we have 2 backs like Tajay and Pollard, and if someone came up to me and told me that they just pushed the button on one of them this summer as a bet, you're leveraging against everybody else that was kind of picking one or the other. And I mean, you are gambling at the end of the day, but you are making a choice and you're leveraging yourself against the rest of the field, which goes back to what you're saying earlier in terms of ownership, right? Like if you have an ownership advantage when you get to the final week, it doesn't matter if last year, not everybody, obviously, but so many people had Kyron Williams. So it's like, well, what's the point? Everybody has Kyron Williams. What's your edge going to be? So this is a spot where if you're knowingly leveraging yourself against the rest of the field, if people do go out and draft Ramondre Stevenson, then this is the spot to put your foot down and leverage yourself on a player.
Yeah, look, the Stevenson stuff, I said it before. I think he's one of those players that can match ADP expectation, but I have a hard time seeing him as a league-winning player because I don't think Antonio Gibson's going to be a 0 each week. Like Gibson, every year of his NFL career, has seen at least a 9.5% target share per game rate. He's he can be a change of pace back. Like, don't forget, he entered the league as like this massively explosive running back who had good size and who played this hybrid role in college. He can catch passes out of the backfield. He's shown that he can catch passes out of the backfield. And Ramondre Stevenson, while he's done that throughout his career, I don't think that anyone would view him as anything more than he's been the body to do that. He's not like a special player as a receiver. He's just a bigger running back who can play all 3 downs. And yeah, he's fine as a receiver, but it's not like we're talking about someone who can like change the game as a receiving threat out of the backfield. Not to say Antonio Gibson can't, but I think that they will still use him to some degree in that role. And if that happens, then Stevenson is overdrafted and Gibson is underdrafted. And then there's the contingent upside of, okay, what if Ramondre Stevenson gets hurt? And of course, what if Antonio Gibson gets hurt? That's also on the flip side, but there's a cost component to this. Like, we're not straight up. Yes, I like Ramondre Stevenson more than Antonio Gibson, but there's still an opportunity cost side to this where, again, I've been clearly opting for like a Najee Harris or a Tony Pollard or a Tajay Spears in that range, or Chase Brown, as opposed to, going that New England direction.
And with the negative drumbeat with this offensive line, running back targets could be way over expectation. If they're so scared that they won't even put Drake May wins the quarterback battle allegedly, but then they won't play him because they don't want him to die. That means there could be a lot of dump offs in this offense, which means, running back target expectation should be way higher than we think.
Yeah. So at quarterback, I'm even flatter. I'll just say my top players, which I don't think any of these are going to be surprising. I have Will Levis, Trevor Lawrence. These are guys above 11%. They're technically all the guys I have above 10%. Will Levis, Trevor Lawrence, Deshaun Watson, which has been a little scary with this injury stuff. I think a healthy Watson is a smash play at ADP. Kyler Murray, who I think is probably the best value although his value's been increasing, but I think, over the summer and such has been arguably the best value on the board. And then Geno Smith, who I like in this Ryan Grubb offense and what they might be able to do with the weapons there. So I don't think, do you see any surprises on there based on what I've been talking about throughout on the show throughout the offseason?
I would flip it to you, and because you speak to more people, are there quarterbacks out there that people are overexposing themselves to? Because to me, the way I draft, except for Lamar and Patrick, who I make a decision on, sometimes even Josh, sometimes in that high area, my quarterbacks are basically who have I drafted earlier, what value has fallen to me, and what stacks are kind of creating themselves, and then I just have to insert the quarterback later. Like, I don't go into a draft ever thinking about drafting a specific quarterback. So are there quarterbacks out there that people are stumping for and specifically overexposing themselves to? So
my fear with this, and this is probably one of the players that I'm scared of most burning me this year. And I don't think I even listed him because we're going to get into that in a second. But I only have 4% Anthony Richardson right now. And yes, that's some, I'm not getting 0, but I can't even remember the last time I drafted Anthony Richardson in BBM. Like, this is a much earlier in the season kind of thing that I was doing with Richardson. Part of that is because I got to the point in maybe mid-July, early July, where I just didn't see a significant enough difference between Kyler Murray and Anthony Richardson in terms of range of outcomes. And so I'm going to get the cheaper guy. I highly doubt I have a ton of Michael Pittman.
I was going to say, you're not a big Pittman guy.
Yeah, yeah. So naturally, I'm not going to get a ton of Richardson. Didn't even draft a ton of Jonathan Taylor, which that could burn me. I still have some. I'm still at maybe 6%. But my fear with Richardson is we know that mobility at the quarterback position is very, very important. Yes, 100%. The mobility aspect, this is something that Mark and I talked about when he came on the show, Mark Garcia. The mobility aspect is more important in a managed season-long league than it is in a best ball environment. And I say that because in a season-long league where you're managing your team, you're having to predict when to use these players. And mobility is the predicting force. It is the thing that we know is sticky week over week, year over year. We know who the mobile guys are. But when you're in an environment where you have 2 or 3 quarterbacks that are rotating, not even just based on like a matchup that you have to predict, oh, this guy has a better matchup, you're seeing the actual result of these players, and then you're able to plug them into your lineup. And so while Richardson will have some very good weeks, there's no doubt about it, we also know that rushing is more of a floor thing than a ceiling thing. And I think that in general, and this is something that I really tried to focus on during the second half of the year whenever I really kind of dug into the idea a little bit more. But I think in general, pocket passers are a little bit undervalued versus mobile quarterbacks in best ball, because pocket passers can still get you a good ceiling. And when you're not having to predict that ceiling, because it's going to be a roller coaster for them, because there's a lot of unpredictability in a guy throwing 4 touchdowns one week and 1 touchdown the next with the same number of yards. It's just how things end up happening and going down from a touchdown perspective. With Anthony Richardson, I think there's still plenty of question marks about him as a passer. And what we saw in our small sample last year was insane, yes, but he also was a part of 100% of their offensive touchdowns in the 2 games that he was completely healthy for. And that's not going to maintain. He's not going to keep that up. It's just literally impossible for him to keep that up. And so I've been a little bit worried about Richardson being slightly overvalued. And like the 5th round and even into the 6th round, there's some really good players there. Like I said, drafting more Kenneth Walker. I tried to up my George Kittle exposure at times this summer. Terry McLaurin is one that I'm drafting a lot more now just because of the Jahan Dotson stuff. I think that he could end up just seeing a lot of looks in that offense. So there's just reasons to opt for other guys in that range than Richardson, in my opinion, especially given all that I talked about with the pocket passers versus the mobile guys, and then Kyler Murray himself going, throughout the summer, a round to 2 rounds after Anthony Richardson. I'll take Kyler Murray there all day long. And
my initial thought after that is then maybe we should just be taking Richardson naked more, right? Mm-hmm. And just hoping he goes out and rushes for a bunch and gets a bunch of points. But again, when we get to week 17, we want guys who, when they score a bunch, the cluster of other players that we drafted also are scoring a bunch. So that doesn't really work for naked Richardson unless you have a bunch of giants. Of course, you can game stack him. Right. So it's one of those where maybe we go 3 quarterback builds with one guy who's just a naked quarterback, and that's a way to fit him in there. But yeah, you're absolutely right. This is one of the biggest misconceptions even in season long right now, where rushing is floor and the passing is the high end. It sucks in season long because when we have a quarterback with a ton of variance in the pocket, it's hard for us to control for that. But in best ball, we kind of have to lean into that variance, right? Because we're looking to blast as high a ceiling as possible. Right, exactly. So this is why I have CJ Stroud in best ball. I didn't fade CJ Stroud. I think I might have more Stroud actually. I'll look right now. I might have more Stroud than I have 7% CJ Stroud. So I have more CJ Stroud than I do Anthony Richardson, which I wouldn't do that in season long, in a managed season long league, but I'm doing that because he's easily stackable. If you get one of those 3 guys early on, or sometimes 2, maybe even sometimes 3, if you get those guys early on, easily stackable, and you know that in a given week, things can still blow up. Just because he's not running the ball doesn't mean that it can't blow up in a singular week. So, maybe this will bite me at the end of the day. Maybe someone's listening to this and they're saying, man, JJ's a moron because he's underexposed to Anthony Richardson. And look, I might. This is all a learning thing for me. I'm trying to be as logical as possible, and I'm trying to consume as much of the information that I've consumed, as possible from talking to these guests. But yeah, man, at the end of the day, I am underexposed to Anthony Richardson, and that does scare me a little bit. I'll move to tight end really quick. It's not a flashy position. It's not as fun. Pat Freiermuth is my top rostered and drafted tight end, and I hate it a lot. I don't feel good about it at all based on some of the preseason usage. I don't think it's going to burn me, burn me, because he's such a late round pick. But it's one that I probably overstated the floor a little bit, because that's kind of how I viewed Freiermuth, is that there was going to be some production coming from him. And I think I just overstated that. And I'm just a little bit overexposed. So that's a mistake, I think, at the end of the day. Jonnu Smith, I still don't think is a mistake. I think they're going to use the tight end a little bit more, and I love the scheme fit.
David Njoku is someone that I've drafted a lot more than I expected I would, but he had that stretch last year during the second half of the year where he was basically the tight end one in fantasy. I think that Cleveland is a team, clearly based on the Deshaun Watson exposure that I have. Cleveland's a team that's going to throw more, spread it out. I'm excited about them, and Njoku is a good talent, so I'm cool with that. Mark Andrews, I've talked him up throughout the offseason. I think that he's been undervalued. And then the last one who's above 10% is TJ Hawkinson, which it's been a little strange for me because I was really out on him to start. And then I just thought to myself, why am I not okay with getting a guy like Hawkinson who has a pretty decent ceiling when active, who could play and start in the middle of the season, and that's when we need him to play. So a lot of my Hawkinson teams are either elite tight end Hawkinson or 3 tight end builds. Really,
God, I loved elite tight end Hawkinson. That was one of my favorite clicks for sure.
Yeah, it's fun. It's fun if you can get like a McBride or a Kelsey and then pair him with Hawkinson, then you can be good. Or I feel I'd probably say when I get to like a Jake Ferguson or even maybe an Ingram and Kittle, that's when I'm thinking 3 tight end build with Hawkinson, but more so Ferguson into Njoku and Brock Bowers is the 3 tight end build with Hawkinson. But that's the direction I ended up going at tight end.
Odell opening up on PUP seems like it might be good for Jonnu, although we obviously want the value later in the season. And then Njoku makes sense because of how much you liked Waddle. And when you're taking Waddle early, then you're trying to look for that Cleveland connection. And so that leads into Watson and Njoku as well.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I think that's another reason why my Cleveland exposure is the way that it is. I'll just really quickly, before we end this, I'll go through 2 things I think that, or maybe just the one thing. I'll go through, because I already talked about Anthony Richardson. I think that he's one of the potential killers of my BBM rosters this year, even though I still have that blanket of having him in 4% of my BBMs. But I'm really low in terms of exposure, not in terms of like necessarily season long takes or anything like that, on the round 3, round 4 running backs this year. And that includes Kyron Williams, Isaiah Pacheco, Derrick Henry, Travis Etienne. Even in that Jacobs Rachaad White tier, I sent a tweet out last week. My Rachaad White exposure is at like 4% in BBM. My Bucky Irving is at 7%. I have more. I didn't even like Bucky Irving as a prospect.
Yeah, I was gonna say
I have more Bucky Irving than Rachaad White. Clearly just because of cost, but it really just comes down to like I don't mind taking the anchor running backs early. Now I'm not overexposed to Taylor. Even Achane I'm not overexposed to, or Saquon, but I have taken them probably more frequently than the Kyron Henry tier. And Pacheco then started rising so much in ADP that it made it difficult to continue drafting him. And then there's pretty good wide receivers, and there's this drop off at wide receiver that just always scared me, right? So I was only getting those running backs when they would fall enough to be after that drop off at wide receiver. And they've been rising so much in ADP that they're in that cluster, and it's made it more difficult for me to go that direction. So really, like if Kyron, basically based on my Blake Corum exposure, if Kyron is just like the true bell cow this year, then that's going to be bad for my bags at the end of the day. Like, I don't think it's going to necessarily sink me because it's only one backfield, one pairing, whatever. But, and it's not like every draft I took Corum, or every draft I didn't take Kyron. But, yeah, I mean, like those situations were just difficult for me to get overexposed to. And there's reasons why, like, I have reasons to fade Kyron in season long. Like, I have reasons to fade him this year. I think that it can obviously go the opposite direction, but, I've talked about those reasons a little bit. I think Pacheco is the one, though, of this group that I wish I had more of. I even wrote him up as a player, as a running back to target at the beginning of May. And I just didn't do it enough because of sort of this FOMO at wide receiver. So that giant group of like low end RB1s, high end RB2s, I wish I had a little bit more, but that's just the name of the game. If you have 5-6% of them, or 5% exposure with them, and then you have 10-11% exposure to some of the wide receivers that go there, that's just a choice based on team structure and what you wanted to do there.
Yeah, and cost. If you look at comparing them to the receivers that were going there, and then fast forward to round 6 through 8, we've talked about those running backs all summer. You look at the cost between those running backs and those receivers available. It's like, what is it? The Tyler Lockett cliff, right? Like once Lockett goes, it's like, it is a barren desert of wide receivers. So if you're not comfortable at the position by then, you're kind of screwed. And then there's all these running backs there that are there for the taking. So it's just the drafts and the ADP have just kind of naturally created this situation.
Yeah, 100%. And it also, like, if you think about Kyron and Derrick Henry in particular, and where they were going for the majority of the summer, it was usually mid-third into that late third. And then now you'll see them pretty frequently in the early third. But when you're in that part of the draft, and if you go and you stray away from wide receiver and you get one of those running backs, okay, fine. But there are many, many drafts where you then get into round 7, and that's the first wide receiver wall, where Brian Thomas is gone. Maybe you're high on Ladd McConkey. I'm not very massively exposed to Ladd McConkey, but maybe you're really high on Ladd McConkey. Keon Coleman's kind of gone in that range throughout the summer. But you're staring at someone like Jamison Williams, who has a ton of question marks. You're staring at, Courtland Sutton, who doesn't have a massively high ceiling. And then you're staring at these running backs in these ambiguous backfields who clearly have tons of upside if things break their way. And that, I think, has played a massive role in why I ended up being a little bit underexposed to those round 3 to 5 running backs this year. But I wouldn't be shocked if I get screwed, or if it really does come back to bite me, that I wasn't exposed heavily enough to those guys.
You just need, since you have so much Rams Cardinals exposure, you just need to get your teams into week 17, and then Kyron, is blessed with the birth of his first baby, perhaps, and misses the game, and all those teams are screwed.
That's what we root for. We don't root for injury on here, of course.
That's right.
That would be ridiculous. We root for babies to be born, right? We root for these healthy 8.5-pound, deliciously cute babies, triplets. We want every NFL player to have triplets that we're underexposed to on week 17. That's all we're asking for. I don't think that's too much to ask for.
That's it.
Oh, man. Rich, man, it was such a pleasure doing this series with you throughout the summer. I know for a fact that a lot of people who hadn't listened to you in the past are now Rich Ryan fans. And I haven't really asked you this because I'm always saying, and without further ado, here's the interview with XYZ. Where can everyone find you, Rich?
You can find me on Twitter at Rich T. Ryan. It is football season, which means it is also Gridiron Gamble season.
Yes.
We do a podcast. We are in Circa Sports Millions. It's a handicapping contest where each week you pick 5 games against the spread. There's 4 of us, so each of us pick 1 game, and then we rank every game in aggregate, and the 5th game is the most confident that the 4 of us are in. We submit it. It's a $1,000 contest. I believe first is more than $1 million. We're also in their winner-take-all $1,000 Survivor contest, where the winner last year, I believe, split $6 million with a couple of people. So you can catch us over there. Hopefully, we can sun run and win us some money.
Heck yeah, man. I'm on Twitter at LateRoundQB, as you guys know. Make sure you are signing up on Underdog with promo code LateRound. You can still get the Late Round Draft Guide for absolutely free when you do that. And you can also get some bonus cash up to $1,000 with Underdog right now. So check that all out, lateround.com. And I got to say, everyone, thank you so much for listening to this series throughout the offseason. It's been a blast. It's been awesome chopping it up with Rich, like I said. It's been awesome interviewing everyone. It's been awesome hearing the feedback and watching all of you and seeing all of you become best ball bros and sisses along with me. So without further ado, Rich, we out.